Welcome, everyone, to our 5th annual Clinic MPI Georgetown program, Immigration. You can imagine I spend a lot of time doing these kinds of perfunctory welcomes, usually about topics I know absolutely nothing about and have even, I shouldn't say less interest, but not as much interest as I have today. But this is obviously an area close to my heart, and we're delighted to see you all here. You know, this was an issue that we thought might be one of the defining issues in the presidential campaign. Imagine if it had been Tancredo or Hunter on the other side, unlikely, but even Giuliani, Huckabee, Romney. On the Republican side, we might really have had some significant differences with ending up with the 3 candidates we have. I think we're in this less interesting campaign on the immigration side, but actually a wonderful time where we might have both parties somewhat fairly close on these immigration issues, which may give us a real strong tailwind going into the new administration, no matter who wins, or for some serious look at the immigration process and some serious reform, hopefully coming out with a policy that's more rational, certainly more humane, more forward-looking than we've had over the past few years. Perhaps a significant reform of the administrative process and the judicial review issues. And I was even thinking this morning, maybe it's time to rename ICE and some other things that maybe we can accomplish in the years ahead here. But more on that later. Right now, it's my great pleasure to welcome and to introduce Senator Leticia Van de Putte, who is a state senator in Texas. She spent 5 terms as a state representative and now is in her 4th term as a Texas state senator. In 2002, Senator Van de Putte became chair of the Senate Hispanic Caucus, and she currently chairs the Texas Senate Democratic Caucus. Nationally, she was nominated as co-chair of the 2008 Democratic National Convention, which should be an incredibly interesting time for you in Denver. And she, therefore, joining the ranks of Texas women, both Barbara Jordan and Ann Richards. She's been actively involved in the National Conference of State Legislatures and served as its president for 2 years, 2006 and 2007. And Senator Van de Putte is also a member of the National Hispanic Caucus of State Legislatures, where she also served as president from 2003 to 2005. She's been an advocate for children, for veterans, for improved access to health care, for quality education and economic development issues, and has been a key author of bills that have helped reform welfare, the juvenile code, and led to greater insurance for children. She received her Bachelor's of Science from the University of Texas at Austin College of Pharmacy, and currently lives in San Antonio with her husband and most of her 6 children, some of whom are spread elsewhere. So it's been a very full and productive life on so many fronts for Senator Van de Putte. We're delighted to have you here. Thank you for being our kickoff keynote speaker. Welcome to Georgetown.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Good morning. Buenos dias. I am delighted to be here and to see old friends, Arturo Vargas. I'm very pleased to see you, and to meet new friends. I am extremely proud and honored to have been asked to be here this morning. But I do want to tell you that as a legislator, as a mommy, as a pharmacist, I can't dissociate my background from a lot of the opinions. I'm going to try to focus on what we have in the states, which is facts. But I wanted to give you a little bit of an idea of where I come from. I'm a native of San Antonio, Texas, although I was born in Tacoma, Washington, at Madigan Hospital, Fort Lewis. That's just because that's where Daddy was when Mama was very pregnant, and she couldn't come back to San Antonio. So I am a native Texan, and actually go back, we think 6, maybe even 7 generations. The joke in our family was that my dad's family, the San Miguel family, grew up around Maverick County, and that is an area along the Texas border where it's Eagle Pass on the U.S. side and Piedras Negras in Mexico. And my family's joke was that the family was there when it was Spain, and we were there, and we were still there when it was France, and we were still there when it was Mexico, and the family was there when it was the Republic of Texas, and then we were still there when it was part of the United States, and we were still there when it was the Confederacy, and we were still there when it was back to the United States. And so the joke in our family is that the family has stayed pretty much in the same area. It was the damn government that kept changing. So if you can get that perspective, but also my family moved to San Antonio, which is a community established by the Spanish and a lot of missions. The first official language was Spanish, and many of our documents are in Spanish. So you can understand kind of our hesitancy when people bring up the English only, when all of our documents, birth records, court records, government records are actually in Spanish first. And it is also part of the border community, but Texas is a very different community. I mean, if you think about it, you meet a Texan, and I know you all have opinions about Texans, notwithstanding our current president, but you've all got opinions of Texans, and we're part of that Southern hospitality. We are also part of the rugged West, where that spirit of individualism and entrepreneurship are admired and cherished. But we're also part of the Latino, mi casa es su casa, very humble, very hardworking. And so when we say hello in San Antonio, it's more like bienvenidos, y'all. And I say that because if you meet a lot of Texans, you will, and they're Latino, and they speak with this drawl, you may not understand, but that's kind of the community that I grew up in. What I wanted to focus on today is what is happening at the state level. And this, we all know that there will be challenges for the new administration. There are debates in all of our 50 states. Originally, people thought that it was an issue in what we call the migration states, the 7 big states. If you think about where the populations of people have headed to, it's California, Texas, Florida, New York, New Jersey, and Arizona. And if you look at that, those, were kind of the traditional states. But in the absence of a comprehensive federal reform, our challenged immigration system, the states have gone through an unprecedented level of activity and have developed a variety of approaches and tried to get some solutions. So in recognizing that it's a very complex issue and state responses vary greatly. States have different experiences and histories. Very, very different along the Texas border and all those southwest states than what we call the new migration states. States like Ohio and North Carolina, South Carolina, the states where they have seen a rapid increase. And so we've got different experiences, different histories, different immigration populations, and very much different resources. So in 2007, and we're going to use 2007 because not all state legislators come in on the even-numbered years. And those that do, a lot of them have just their budget sessions. So we're going to focus to give you a good idea of what happened on some of what happened in the legislatures in 2007. There were 1,400 bills related to immigrants introduced. That means everything from driver's licenses to law enforcement, from human trafficking and employment. And this is, again, because I think the states were extremely frustrated at the lack of the federal government being able to have a comprehensive reform package. So of those, this will just give you kind of an idea of where the bills that were introduced, how many states, and how many were actually enacted. The state laws, there were 204 of the 240 of the 1,400 that related to immigrants or to a residency or a driver's license, anything that had to do with that were actually enacted. And states introduced, or legislators introduced, 3 times more bills in 2007 than in 2006. But understand, a lot of states aren't in on those even-numbered years. But the number of enactments have also tripled. Every policy area, if you look at education, employment, health, human trafficking, we had a lot introduced on that. But it seemed like the most predominant dealt with IDs and driver's license. I think that we all agree that Congress needs to act on this, and hope that they will have, and the new administration will put that as a priority. But it seemed to focus a lot on border enforcement and certainly border security. I know in my state, the wall that is now called El Muro de Odio, which means the wall of hate. My colleagues in the legislatures and in the government of our neighbor, which Texas' #1 trading partner is Mexico, to the tune of $62 billion a year. So we know that this will have a symbolic effect, but they're calling it the El Muro de Odio, which means the wall of hate. Not a good sign for the type of economic development that we have, and communities like my family's that had crossed back and forth, not 1 generation, 2 generations, 3 but up to 6 and 7 generations. Overlay that with border communities that have waste disposal, electricity, water, that those plants serve both communities as a requirement of NAFTA and the Border Environmental Commission and the NAD Bank. So when that passed, so much was put into infrastructure, and we have particularly water and wastewater programs and plants and facilities that serve Texas border communities but actually are located on the Mexican side. Now the pumps may be in the river, so there's understand that the backlash from the border communities when Secretary Chertoff kind of dismantle all those environmental rules. And then there's the landowners' access to cattle, all of the environmental concerns. But that symbol of border security and the fence has been taken in different viewpoints across the country. Some see it as an avid symbol that our doors will be closed. Others see it, as I have described to you, as an unbelievable wall of hate. So let's look at some of the things that the federal government, of course, has not done, and including that when we've talked about law enforcement and SCAP, health, social services, English language acquisition, you can see that the number of bills that have been introduced in the states and enacted laws. There was a great push to repeal in the states which passed the DREAM Act. And I'm hopeful that everybody understands the DREAM Act. The DREAM Act allows students who have been in the states but lack citizenship status to pay in-state tuition rates. Texas passed its DREAM Act in 2001, and I can tell you there was a significant effort to repeal that in the Texas House in the 2007 legislative session. But there are states that are still trying to pass a DREAM Act, and there are some states that are trying to repeal the one that they have passed. But hopefully this will give you an idea of the unprecedented activity that has occurred. I wanted to look to really just touch on the demographics. If you think about 1 in 5 children today live in immigrant families, and many of those children are U.S. citizens. And I have a colleague in the Texas Senate, and we've got those types of legislators all over that are trying to push the issue of what they call anchor babies. to the Supreme Court. This is in an effort to deny citizenship to those children born in the United States, but of parents not citizens. I certainly hope that that doesn't get anywhere across all of our country. But understand that many states have introduced that type of legislation, or many legislators have. Of course, we are very happy that that has not passed or not been tested. But if you think about the overall population, this is significant. It's going to continue to grow, and it is, when we think about who's in the labor market, 15% of our labor market in 2006 are foreign-born workers. Think about it. 2006, 15% of our labor force, and they've accounted for half of the growth in the labor force. I'm going to look real quickly to what our demographers are telling us. And the data that I'm using is from the University of North Carolina, Dr. Johnson, who really looked at this at the request of the North Carolina legislators, as we got requests in Texas from North Carolina of how do you handle bilingual education? What do you do about health care? And them taking best practices of communities who had always had Spanish language speakers and adopting that so that they could meet federal requirements of No Child Left Behind, all of the health requirements on the Medicaid programs. And so as the North Carolina legislature found itself trying to come up with solutions to some challenges in a population that they hadn't had in large numbers, they turned to states that had dealt with this and had dealt with it successfully. And so Dr. Johnson looked at what has been the change and what will be the change. And if you look at, we've got, of course, percent changes for all of our races and ethnicities. But if you look, the population that will grow the most, although the myth is that it's going to be Latinos, actually the percentage growth is in our Asian Pacific Islander community. But certainly the numbers will indicate that it is the Latino population. He calls this America's color adjustment. So besides all the demographics that you have seen about the grain of America, and I see quite a few baby boomers in the audience, and I see quite a few young people. Just think of the baby boomers as the people who went to school with slide rules. That's the way you don't go by hair color, but of understanding that the grain of America is such that the replenishment of workers that will be needed, particularly when it comes to important things like retirement and pension funds, who's going to pay that, but also as we get in a more aged capacity, our healthcare status and who is going to be the healthcare workers that will care for these huge numbers of baby boomers. And so when we talk about the grain of America, that certainly is a very important consideration. But what Dr. Johnson talks about is the browning of America. And if you look at what the population percentages will be, he says that it's 2050, although that there has been data that suggests that that will occur, that where Latinos will be at least a quarter of the population could possibly occur as early as 2030 and 2035. There will be more of our baby boomers that are going to be leaving the workforce, and we will reach in the United States a negative fertility rate. And that as early as 2015. Now, that is where the UN World Population Prospects and their Department of Economic and Social Affairs, that's at the break point where the live birth is not sufficient for the population to replace itself. Let's look at a little bit about the median age and race by gender. So if you look at our median ages in 2000, look at, if you look at just the U.S., our median age, male and female, is around, 34 years of age for males and 36 and a half for females. And sorry, gentlemen, but we tend to outlive you a little bit. That, though, is narrowing as women enter the workforce and have habits of risk that are the same to the male population. But if you look at certainly I'd like you to come down to the Hispanic. Both the male and female are at about 25 years old. That's the median age. And why is this important? Well, if you look at reproductive cycles, it is people in their 20s and early 30s that, for the most part, are childbearing ages. And if you look at the population of white, not Hispanic, or white alone, and again, these are Dr. Johnson's slides that I've taken, it is closer to the 40 year on both the male and the female side. And not that I haven't had girlfriends that have become pregnant in their 40s. It's just that that has not been the norm. So if you look at our median age by race and gender, you can understand that that's where a lot of the basis is this is coming. We know that the fertility indicators that are by, this is foreign-born and native-born and Hispanic origin. So this is by births per 1,000. And if you look at the native-born, it's about 61 and a half births per 1,000. Hispanic of any race, it's almost close to 80. Not Hispanic, about 60. But look at the foreign-born, and particularly the Hispanic of any race, foreign-born, is at 112 per 1,000. Now, my husband is Piet van de Putte of Belgian and French and English, and he looks at this, and of course his comment, always the jokester, is he said, well, I can tell you that. You don't need to any figures on that. He says, I just know that Latinos are just sexier and better looking. So, I mean, you don't need all of these. And I said, Pete, I don't think that that's a variable here. He says, well, I married you, didn't I? And we had 6 kids, didn't we? I said, yes. Yes, we did. 6 and 9 years. I don't know what we were thinking now that 3 of them are in college. But if you look at that birth rate, it is an unbelievable indicator that is the basis for our demographics. And helps us very much when we're talking about replacement of workers. And particularly that our migration to the United States happens at both ends of the socioeconomic spectrum. I think the media would have you believe that it's always the low-income workers that are coming in. And yes, our migrant population is 20% of the low-income workers in the United States. It is a total of about 37% of our agriculture employees, 23% of our service industry, and 42% of what we call the home maintenance. But also, the immigrant population represents 50% of research and development workers and 25% of our physicians and our nurses and healthcare professionals. So when we're telling the story, we're not telling the story of both sides of the spectrum. But if you look at our birth indicators, you know that the new administration will be challenged to create that policy that incorporates all of our states' experiences. I think the states are going to continue to address both enforcement and integration issues. And they're going to do so in a manner that hits, again, both sides of the spectrum. Where we had states that tried to enact legislation that was very restrictive on access to driver's license. We had other states, like Illinois, that wanted to use the identification of la matricular to be able to get driver's license. Where we had states that wanted to absolutely punish employers for any perceived violation, and very difficult without a verification system in place. We had states that would offer kind of immunity to employers, given the fact that there was no verification base that was actually valid that they could use. And so we saw legislation enacted from all sorts. But I think the most important was under current law, our state and local enforcement authorities are charged with enforcing criminal immigration violations. I think for us, when the U.S. House passed H.R. 4437, which proposed that shift in federal responsibility of enforcing the civil immigration law to local law enforcement, the states reacted. Some of them and local authorities grabbed onto it and latched by allowing their local police forces or state forces to be able to enforce criminal immigration statutes. Other states really asked for help because they did not want to divert their critical resources from local law enforcement. But I think what everybody agreed to is that the legislation failed to provide any funding or training for our state and local officials regarding the complexities of immigration law. So understand that most of the folks that are now doing so are doing so in the law enforcement community with very little training. Enforcement really at the federal level, and I think many states believe that it should remain that. I think another thing that you saw in the states would address public health and health care, particularly access to emergency rooms. Costs are significant. As we look at costs of health care, we saw a lot of debate in the states about access to health care. So, again, nothing at the federal level enacted, but you saw different states look at that. We've always been a welcoming society. Always. And unfortunately, the word immigrant has taken on a connotation tied to the word illegal or alien. And that's a fact. And part of that is the media. Part of that is just the hype. And let's face it, when you're in an election year and you've already done gays and guns, this could possibly be the new wedge issue. And so you'll find in many states that that I think will play a big issue in the November elections. I find it extremely offensive. Those that said, okay, we've got to deport immediately all 12 million or 14 million, how many numbers there are. It is adding complexities to our family units, but it's very personal. It's very, very personal in that families would be ripped apart. And I think sometimes my colleagues don't understand in the legislature that some of the things that they say are extremely hurtful. I'm going to give you one example. Very well-respected colleague of mine was talking about border enforcement. And yes, we agree that, yes, border enforcement is important. But they were looking at a slideshow presentation of an aerial view of our Rio Bravo, or the Rio Grande River. And my colleague said, look, you can see them. They're crossing the river like little ants. And I know that my colleague didn't mean to offend me, but it greatly offended me because she just called my grandmother an insect. And she was the most beloved person in our family. And so to reduce a human being to an insect, I don't think people understood. And when I questioned my colleague on it, they said, well, you know, I just meant that they were coming over. And I said, but it's that type of terminology. And you don't understand, this is a different issue than from guns. Because it's about people's families. It's about their mothers and fathers and their brothers and sisters. And yes, it's about economic and workforce. I think another moment when we were able to turn around that colleague of mine, through the National Conference of State Legislators, we put together 2 years ago a task force on immigration and spent 2 days at the Nogales checkpoint, the Nogales area in Arizona, and spent the day with Border Patrol in the Jeeps and around, and then went to the holding center. And that day's take was approximately 500 who had tried to cross. And you go into this big barn and this big building, and to see people in cages, it's not just a jail. And my colleague, I think, was thinking to see young men, single men, drug runners in their 20s and 30s. But what we saw were overwhelming women and children and infants and families. And as the Border Patrol sector told us, and why it was imperative that he thought that we, as a nation, confront this. And he said, ma'am, I can, you see these 500 people in cages. He says, I've only got about 500 in this enforcement, in this whole sector. And he said, you see these 500 here. Now I want you to come across over here, and I want you to see these 20. And there were 20, and yes, they were all male, pretty young, some of them probably no more than 50. And there were only about 20 of them. And he turned to us and he said, our enforcement officers can spend all our time and resources trying to get these people who want to take care of your children, and they want to do your lawns, and they want to work in the hotels, or I can take care of these 20 that want to sell your daughter drugs. I can't do both. Cannot do both. And until this government gives us a clear indication of what is the priority, then I'm going to have to spend all our time and resources on these families. And it was a stark contrast. And I think at that point my colleague understood how offensive it was for him to call my grandmother an insect. So we are hoping that with this new administration that the angels of good will descend upon the new Congress and the new administration, and that they will take the data, and that they will take information, and that they will take an approach that will provide for a comprehensive reform that doesn't rip families apart and doesn't cause massive disruptions in any economic sector. We are hoping. And it's forums like this that help persuade the policymakers and inform people that hopefully they will make the right decision. Thank you. And I think we have some time for some questions.
We have microphones in the front here. If people want to step up to the microphones and ask questions.
Anybody? Now's your chance to grill somebody.
Senator, thank you for coming. In
Can you identify yourself, please?
Yes, Dan Kowalski, Bender's Immigration Bulletin, also from Austin. In the next Texas legislature, do you think Mr. Berman will raise the whole birthright citizenship issue again? And if so, what's the likely outcome?
Representative Leo Berman is from East Texas. He's from Tyler, and has a growing number of Latinos in that population, as they have many chicken processing plants and agricultural workers, timber workers. But the profile looks very much like a Carolina, both in demographics and in business. Leo Berman is not alone in the type of folks that would really introduce very egregious, very hurtful legislation. But I saw him the other day, and yes, he plans to introduce everything. He would really love the question, particularly of what he calls anchor babies, to reach the U.S. Supreme Court. And he really feels he's right on this. He really feels he's right. And he said, Leticia, I hope you don't take this personally and take offense. And I said, well, yes, I do. But I've got to thank you for doing so. And I said, understand what happened to California after Pete Wilson. Governor Bush in Texas received over 40%, maybe 45% of the Latino vote. That was not by mistake. When he was governor, he basically told members of the state legislature that if they even filed a bill that had that sort of language in it, not only if it reached his desk would he veto it, but he would veto any piece of legislation with that member's name on it. Contrast that with Pete Wilson in California, who took a different approach. Now, understand, at the time, my governor did that not for, and I don't think it was a social justice. It was an economic factor. After Pete Wilson had all that rhetoric, California went totally Democratic. Now, I'm sitting in a state that has no Democratic statewide office holders. I'm about the highest ranking Democrat in the state. No, none at the Supreme Court, none at any level. No statewides. As long as I have guys like Leo out there pushing the edge, I'm going to get more Democrats, because even common sense economic Republicans will say you've gone too far. And the pendulum will swing even closer. So one of my colleagues in the House, who chairs the House caucus, says, you know, if we didn't have Leo out there, we ought to pay a guy to be a Leo. Because it's going to help us politically get back. Now, I think he'll introduce it, but I think, again, we will be able to stop it. But we barely were able to stop the repeal of the DREAM Act. But I think that there are some political implications. And there are those in the Latino community who are on marginal states that the pendulum may swing back. And if our current congressional elections, those 3 elections, are any indication that the Democrats may be onto something, I think that this adds furor to it. There's going to be, even though a lot of the bills that were introduced, the stuff that passed was pretty right on. It was human trafficking, which is a huge problem. I mean, when you think about it, we have slavery. We have slavery in this country. And I-10, the corridor in my state, is like the #1 corridor for human trafficking. So we saw a lot of states pass human trafficking statutes, employment stuff that were penalties to employers but gave them an out if they didn't have a verification system. So it was kind of with a wink-wink. But I think the stuff that passed, other than Oklahoma, which was they're now beginning to feel some economic repercussions from that. The Oklahoma legislation that passed, it was kind of on the Leo Berman side. I think Arizona has passed some that might be there as well. But I think that we're going to see it. We're going to see it in debates. But I'm hoping and praying that the common sense will win out and that we won't pass those types of measures that are hurtful, harmful, and destroy the human dignity of people who are here to get a job. Another question? Anybody? Yes.
Hi, thanks so much for being with us. You made reference in your remarks to the importance of a verification system. Yes. There's a lot of controversy that surrounds the one that's being used right now, mm-hmm. E-Verify. Is there discussion at the state level? Do you have any experiences that you can convey to national policymakers based on what is taking place now with the verification system that's voluntary?
Yes, the states were in great discussion with the federal government, Department of Homeland Security, and also all of the departments that have to access that verification system. But it was not due to an immigration discussion. When Congress passed the Real ID Act, it did so as an attachment to a funding bill for the war that was gone through. We were in a negotiated rulemaking. We, being the states, were in a negotiated rulemaking with the Department of Homeland Security on Real ID. Now, this Real ID is the system of driver's license. It came as a recommendation to the federal government from the 9/11 Commission, and we were on a negotiated rulemaking on that. In those discussions, states would have to verify, and part of it was the verification and validation systems. And there are 5 that the federal government has to have up and running so that the states can actually validate and verify IDs, but it could also be used greatly for employers. When Congressman Tancredo put that on, that must funding bill, the negotiated rulemaking stopped. And what we've seen is the federal government hasn't put any money into that system. Now, they tell us that they are going to have that up and ready because the Real ID Act, although they've had an extension of it for states to comply, they're making the states pay for it. And they're making you pay for it by every time you access your driver's license systems, the verifications, all that. So they're pushing. So they know they need to update it, but Congress hasn't even put in the funds for it, and they're making the states pay for it. And so the discussion has been, yes, it needs to be an improved system, and we've had numerous dialogue with Secretary Chertoff and Undersecretary Barth on this verification system. But they're not willing to put in any money to it. And until I think the business community stands up and says, if you're going to expect us to actually have to check with any degree of validity, because I don't know about you, I have seen, Dean, the documents. I can't tell a false document from a real document. And you can't. You really can't. And to hold HR directors criminally liable for that, or business owners, is very, very difficult. But that's one of the cases that my grandmother's wisdom comes into play. That grandmother, who my colleague called an insect, always used to say, el que sabe que no sabe, sabe algo, which means if you know what you don't know, you know something. Right? We know something. We know what doesn't work, and we know the current verification validation systems are not accurate at all. And so we're hoping that the outcry from the business community will demand from the next administration and next Congress the type of resources that are needed to update that in a manner that, if we're going to put sanctions on employers, then we've got to be able to give them the verification systems to be able to do the work diligently, and also allow for some due process for those employers once they're charged with those types of sanctions. So we're hoping, but again, we know what doesn't work and we know what's not there, and it's not there right now.
Let me take the prerogative of the chair and ask a question. Senator, a lot of people thought we had a chance at comprehensive reform last year or so when we had a Republican president and a Democratic Congress seemingly united on a set of proposals. It failed for a number of reasons, one of which was probably stronger than anticipated objections at the local level on the regularization provisions. Do you see any shift in that opposition at the local level, or do you think if a comprehensive bill were brought forward, even in the current Congress, which seems unlikely, or early in the next administration, that they would face the same kind of opposition on the regularization side from the grassroots?
I think that there are many communities, Dean, that are like Farmers Branch in Texas. They've seen a new migration in. They are uncomfortable with the rapidity and the great increase. They are uncomfortable in that community because they see Spanish language signs up in businesses. They are uncomfortable because they see children in their schools. They're uncomfortable because it's a new dimension and it's a huge increase. And so the local communities have, I think, fought back, even though there have been efforts to try to put common sense. But I think that there are going to be communities who will definitely act up, as we say. But I'm hoping that when the new administration, and it may be that this is not going to be an issue that's going to be done the first 100 days. You know how administrations have their first 100-day agendas. I think that the new administration, new Congress, will have to get its feet wet, hang on to some, and have maybe a victory in something else first, then kind of ease into it, lean into it, give chance for communities to put input. But it's something that has to be done. It's like on the checklist. We're hoping that it gets done within the first year, but it may not be. But I think that there's going to be resistance from local communities. I think that there are going to be some states that are not going to be opposed to the comprehensive reform, but they're going to say, as in everything that happens at the federal government with a lot of the preemptions that we see and a lot of the unfunded mandates, they're going to come up with a system but put all the cost to the states. And when we think about it, it repeats the pattern. When the New York Fed says, our Social Security system is sustainable and functional 7.5 more years because of the unclaimed Social Security benefits from immigrants, then the positives of a lot of of our new populations here accrue at the federal level, but the costs accrue at the state level, at the local level, with education and health and law enforcement. And the federal government has been very reluctant, other than the SCAP funds and a few other, a couple of million here, a million there, been reluctant to help states and local communities. And I think that where we see the type of views that we've seen from local communities is that they've seen a big shift in population and they're not equipped to handle it. And I'm going to tell you another story. I had a fellow that I sat in the house with, just a great guy by the name of Billy Clements. Billy Clements was from East Texas, and he loved to be called a Bubba. So I say that with not a derogatory term. He called himself Bubba. And Billy Clements could have, in fact, he represented the area that Leo Berman represents. And he could have very well, had he still been in the legislature, authored some of those bills. And fought us in the legislature at every term, the Real ID Act and all sorts of things. Bilingual education, was not a supporter of that. Just could not see the common sense. And then his daughter fell in love with the 6'2" Mauricio Ortiz, who was going to A&M University. He was the brownest Mexican-American I have ever seen. Gorgeous man, gorgeous young man. And so his daughter falls in love, who also happened to be in the Corps, okay, from South Texas, Mauricio Ortiz. And so they get married. And then they have a beautiful baby. And that baby doesn't look anything like Mama. That baby looks like Daddy's family. And so here's Billy Clements on the house floor with this grandbaby. First grandbaby, joyous. And he came up to me and he says, I want to be an author of the hate crimes bill this year. And he said, I don't ever want my grandson to be discriminated against. Ever, ever, ever. And I want to join you on bilingual education. And so it is personal. And his change and his shift didn't happen until love happened. And I think when he saw that beautiful brown skin of his grandbaby, all of a sudden it came very close to home that his daughter would have to teach their grandson how to react at a police stop, like we tell all of our children, and that's difficult. I mean, I have 3 sons, and 2 of them have green and blue eyes and very fair skin, and my other one, thank the Lord, is just tall, dark, and handsome. But I had to school him in how to react at a police stop. Because I know profiling occurs, and we know what the data shows us. And this happens for men of color and people of color. I told him, honey, do not grab your wallet. Don't get for the injury. I said, the police car stops you. You just put your hand on the dash, and you do not move until that officer. And then when he asks you, then you tell him, I'm reaching for my... And then I realized that I never told that to my son Gregory or Paul. And maybe it's good that I should tell them, but I was so concerned because I know what happens in my communities. And so, yes, I think that local officials are going to put up a stink in some areas, but I'm hoping, just like Billy Clements, that with enough Latinos, love happens. Or probably, as a friend of mine said, you don't realize how many folks are being raised by Latina nannies, and they're going to have that Latino heart because they're raised by Latino nannies. I'm also encouraged, and I think what helps us keep focus, and for people like you, I've got to say, for those of you who work in this area, but those of you who work in the law, I have a great friend who always said, when I got real frustrated with some of my colleagues, she told me, and she's a great civil rights attorney, she says, never attribute to malice that which can easily be explained by stupidity. And I will remember that as we face this immigration debate. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator, for a terrific kickoff for what should be a terrific day. Thank you so much for being here with us. We'll turn to our next panel.